Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Far out, no, far north. Thank you, George, for inviting me to speak tonight about why I want young people to go to do canoe trips in the Canadian far north. It's a real honor to present here at this year's symposium. As I talk, you will see slides from many of the trips that I've done in the Yukon and the Northwest Territories. They're going to be playing on the screen behind me, but I won't speak about individual slides. Please think of them as a sort of a tone poem to the Canadian far north. And a very big thank you to Al Pace and Lynn Ward of Canoe North Adventures, who prepared the slideshow and with whom I have done all of my many canoe trips over the last 11 years because they run the very best northern adventure trips. You will see a big log Canoe North Outfitting Center in Norman Wells. I'd like to point out that it was built by and for canoe trippers and is a center for guided and self-managed trips. And you should also watch for shots of His Royal Highness, the Duke of York, otherwise known as Prince Andrew. The Duke has done many paddling trips with Canoe North Adventures, which just shows you that even a prince of the realm travels to our far north for real adventure. All of us here tonight share a passion for paddling and wilderness. For some, it started in childhood, while others didn't see the light until much later. But no matter, when it happens, canoe tripping in the wilderness fires the imagination. I was recently at an event where Wade Davis, the renowned Canadian ethnobiologist, anthropologist, author, and explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society, was the speaker. I was captivated by his observation that the Canadian far north is an unconscious, inescapable, great weight on the imagination of Canadians, the pressure of which goes to form our national character. And if what he says is true for all Canadians and our character, whether they have ever been to the far north or not, imagine what happens when you actually go there. My first trip to the far north, about which I'll tell you a little more shortly, triggered a discovery. An unknown character had long lived inside me and was yearning to get out and express herself. My children and friends on that trip named her Madame Zoom. Because I so strongly associate her with the far north, I'm wearing her signature attire while I give this talk. And by the way, you will also see her in the slideshow as she reads poems to tripmates around the campfire. Don't worry, I'm not really losing my mind. It's just the impact of the far north on this Canadian's imagination at work. But I should tell you that my imaginary alter ego, Madame Zoom, loved poetry, lived during the Yukon Gold Rush in the late 1890s, hiked the Chilkoot Trail, found work as an English teacher in Dawson City. But in her spare time, she dressed like a dance hall girl and read poetry to the sourdough gold miners at Diamond Lil's Saloon in Dawson. Now she comes out on canoe trips. Got that? All right, is she real? Well, I don't know. As I said, the far north fires the imagination, so let yours go. Now, why is this talk called Far Out? No, Far North. Let me explain. In 1970, while finishing my undergraduate degree at Victoria College at the University of Toronto, Walter Gordon, Peter Newman, and Abe Rothstein formed the Committee for an Independent Canada to promote Canadian economic and cultural independence. Post-1967, our centennial year, Canadian nationalism had grown quite muscular, and we Canadians were flexing those muscles. We wanted to set limits on foreign investment and ownership. The committee produced small, sticky-backed flyers, which many people interested in Canadian independence, including university students like myself, plastered on posts, billboards, walls, windows, and car windshields. You might recall seeing these flyers. They were red, white, and blue and showed a map of North America covered from top, our Arctic, to bottom in the stars and stripes. The only words on these flyers were Committee for an Independent Canada. That said it all. Those extremely sticky flyers were very hard to remove. If I put one on anything belonging to you back then, please accept my apologies now. Now, I want you to know we were not anti-American, but we were strongly pro-Canadian. And being university students, some of us English majors, we took this opportunity to put a very Canadian stamp on popular language. We went to work promoting ultra-Canadian expressions, and I'll give you some examples. Instead of saying cool, we said cold. Instead of saying heavy, we said frigid. And instead of saying far out, we said far north. What can I say? It was 1970 and people talked like that. And besides, we were young, but it does explain my title. The Canadian far north is very cool. Oh, make that cold. So the far north, to me it sounded so romantic, so very wild, untamed, and truly free. It conjured the exotic. Even as a little girl, I loved the poetry of Robert Service, the Bard of the Yukon. Born in England in 1874, he came to Canada as a young man and was totally smitten with the romance of the gold rush. I'll bet you know some of his poems, too. You probably studied them in school. The Shooting of Dan McGrew and the Cremation of Sam McGee. There are strange things done 'neath the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. The Arctic trails have their secret tales which would make your blood run cold. The Northern Lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake Labarge when I cremated Sam McGee. Robert Service was the people's poet. He wrote lilting ballads full of excitement and humor, which told dramatic stories about life in the far north. He was a most popular and famous international poet at that. In fact, he would have been featured regularly in People and Us magazines had they been published back then. No poor, starving, garret living poet was he. In fact, he made over $500,000 from the shooting of Dan McGrew alone. People just couldn't get enough of his rollicking, descriptive poetry. Service offered the world access to adventures in the Canadian wilderness, hiking and canoeing, appreciating the land, and he painted an entire world in rolling, rhythmic verses. His poems helped introduce and define Canada to the rest of the world. Service died in 1958 when I was 10 years old. I was reading his poetry in my bunk bed at home at night at Bathurst Steeles in the far north of Toronto. I fell in love with the real Canadian far north through his poetry, and I determined that one day I too would paddle through the wilderness. Well, it took me nearly 45 years to get there, and then I found that the far north was everything and more than I had ever hoped for, expected, or dreamed of. Hence my determination to get today's young people to our far northern reaches now, preferably in canoes, the way the North is meant to be experienced. To this end, I recently joined the board of the Canadian Canoe Museum in Peterborough, Ontario, because this national museum does a powerful job of explaining the significance of the canoe in Canadian history. It has a marvelous collection of historic canoes, and the museum is both popular and academic, and it has excellent programs to get children and teens out paddling. And that way, this very important Canadian heritage will not be lost. If you haven't been to the Canadian Canoe Museum, I urge you to go and take as many children and teenagers as you can possibly manage. It will inspire them, and it will inspire you too. Now, about that, let's hear it for the Canadian Canoe Museum. Now, about that first trip I made to the far north, paddling the Big Salmon and the Yukon rivers with two of my children. It was a dream come true, but in retrospect, it was also a very big leap of faith. Though I'd sent my daughter and two sons to tripping camps from the time each of them turned 7, yes, I was living vicariously. I had never paddled a real canoe myself, and I'd never slept in a real tent in my life. But, newly single with 3 very young teens, one day I said to my sons, "Boys, we're heading to the Yukon." We were going to go and do a whitewater canoeing adventure while their sister Tess did her 50-day canoe trip in Northern Ontario. Thank goodness Malcolm and Gareth and I were with Canoe North Adventures, because the truth is I really didn't have a clue about what I was getting us into. We took our gear list to Mountain Equipment Co-op, we bought our airline tickets, and before we knew it, we were in Whitehorse. When we put our canoes into the water that first day, I recall thinking, "Wendy, you've really done it this time. There's no turning back until we take out at Carmack's in 12 days. Was I worried? Well, sort of, yes. I knew my sons were experienced canoeists and campers and that they would be fine, but I didn't really want to make a fool of myself in front of them. Teenage boys can be so cruel. And I certainly didn't want to spoil it for anybody else on the trip either by doing something dangerous or stupid. On the other hand, I do like jumping into things with both feet, not canoes. On day 1, we paddled all afternoon, and so far, so good, and then we set up camp. But the first thing my brand new friend and tent mate, Doreen, did after we had struggled to pitch our little tent was to hang a tiny magnifying mirror in it so she could apply her makeup the next morning. This worried me. I had no makeup with me. It wasn't on the gear list. However, Madame Zoom managed to emerge from our tent just before dinner with red gloves, a boa, rhinestone earrings, and Robert Service poems in hand. Life was good, and so was dinner. That night, however, Doreen and I practically froze to death in our tent. It was a very cold, clear night, and neither of us knew enough about camping to close some of the wide-open flaps and vents of our tent. We shivered uncontrollably all night long, but we survived. As we paddled through those days to come, we laughed and laughed about our many mistakes. I was hooked. I'd had an epiphany. Canoe tripping was wonderful, and I could at last be part of the magic and the mystery of Robert Service's poetry. All I had to do was survive the next 11 days. Every day, the wonders of the far north were spread before us like a daily banquet, smooth green water and choppy white water, glorious rocks both above and below the river surface, mountains, bears, moose, mergansers, sweepers, log jams, fish, eagles, and that ever-present and wondrous midnight sun. My boys were happy, and so was I. Campfires were for Madame Zoom, poetry, and really good dinners. Doreen and I laughed so hard some nights, Lynn had to come over and order us to be quiet so the others could sleep. As Robert Service had said of the Yukon summer, no sweeter was ever. That trip began my relationship with our far north, and since then, just so that you know this isn't only the blush of first love talking, in addition to the salmon and Yukon rivers, I have continued to take my sons and my daughter on many trips in the Yukon and the Northwest Territories. I've also paddled the Keel and Mackenzie rivers 3 times, the Pelly and Yukon rivers, the Snake River twice, the Mountain River, the Redstone River, the Horton River to Franklin Bay, where we skinny dipped in the Arctic Ocean. And trust me, a person is actually cleansed and reborn in the frigid waters of that ocean. In fact, it is so cold that it burns you from the outside in, and it purifies you. You emerge a new person. I have also hiked the Chilcoot Gold Rush Trail, the Chilcoot Gold Rush Trail, spent a week hiking in the Mackenzie Mountains at the Arctic Circle, right where the Mad Trapper of Rat River had his big shootout with the Mounties in 1932. And I've hiked about 100 miles of the Cannell Trail in the Northwest Territories. I did a week-long expedition with a trapper on his lines northeast of Whitehorse one winter trapping marten, wolf, and lynx. And last year, I went with Al Pace and Kim, who's here tonight, in Al's big truck, towing a trailer, packing 6 canoes and summer supplies on the long drive from Edmonton all the way to Norman Wells in the Northwest Territories, which afforded us the experience of driving the legendary Ice Road. Part of the route was frozen muskeg, and part was frozen over rivers and lakes. And this summer, we plan to paddle the Coppermine River. My goal is to take some University of Toronto Victoria College students on their first ever canoe trip in the far north. This isn't a fundraising talk, but if you'd like to make a donation of airline points or money to help defray the costs for the students, please do get in touch with me through George Lusty. Why do I think it's critical that our young people paddle in the far north? Well, I am very happy to tell you why. When I was installed as Chancellor at Vic, I knew that University of Toronto and Victoria College were very hard to get into. So I also knew it was safe to assume that the students were already committed to their studies. So I wanted to concern myself with their health and their well-being and their potential as leaders in Canada. I told them, if you smoke, stop now. Commit to looking after your body through regular exercise, the right amount of healthy food, and enough sleep, and prepare yourself for the challenges that our country is facing in the world's last real frontier by visiting our far north and by learning about it. Canadians, even if we live in southern Ontario, are a northern people in the eyes of the world. When you travel abroad, heck, even if you only go across the border to Buffalo, they will remind you of this. When you read the papers, listen to the news, follow politics or business or social issues, you cannot escape the fact that the world is watching our far north and the riches that can be found there, whether the increasingly attractive sea routes, the oil and gas for export, the minerals to be mined, or the gorgeous and unspoiled wilderness landscape to be explored. There are complex social and geopolitical problems with our First Nations people and the Inuit, with global warming, with environmental damage and risks, with creating sustainable communities, and with infrastructure. There are opportunities, but advantages and dangers abound in every form of development. How can we, or our future leaders, make informed and wise decisions if we've never even seen or experienced the places we are entrusted to manage and to care for? How can future leaders know what to do? Who will they listen to? What policies will they create? And how are they going to vote? My interest is not really politics, but rather education. And I believe that experiencing the Canadian far north, as difficult and as expensive as it is to get there, should be part of what our bright young people are exposed to. Soon enough, they will need to figure out the answers to some very important questions. What is Canada's place in the world? What is this north that is always there in the Canadian consciousness, but which relatively few Canadians have actually seen or hiked or paddled? And that's why I believe we must get young people paddling in the far north. It's a first step to understanding what we have and what is at risk. I believe we will make them better Canadians, better equipped to answer the call and the questions, whether through artistic, literary, academic, social, scientific, political, or economic engagement. I believe they need this exposure to our land and our people in remote northern regions of Canada to prepare for the issues they will have to face. We are at a critical time in our history, a time when other very powerful nations seriously and openly covet our riches, and they are willing to challenge our sovereignty. Either we will be successful in protecting and husbanding our land and waters with care, or we won't, and we'll lose them. Simple as that. It is important now, but it will become urgent and it will become critical in the years ahead. We must understand and value all aspects of our very precious far north, and it won't be easy because Canada is a very hard land. Wade Davis also observed that our far north is wilderness, vast, unexplored, and very, very rare. His prescription? First we must explore, next we must understand, and then we must claim sovereignty and protect this heritage. I believe he hit the nail on the head. I've told you the dominant reasons why I want youth to paddle in the far north, but there are other reasons, smaller, more personal, which I'll share with you now. No doubt you have experienced them yourself. Thoreau expressed the idea that a person can measure his or her wealth best by what they can live without. What better way to learn that lesson than on a canoe trip? I ask you, as experienced canoeists and campers, what greater joy can be found, even in a grand and luxurious home, than that of being dressed in your long johns, snug in your sleeping bag, inside a little nylon tent, all cozy and dry, preferably with a good friend, while a big, cold, wet storm flashes and blows all around you. Let's face it, you have practically nothing in that tent, but it provides a lesson in having only what you need, and what heaven that can be. And what happier moment can you know than brushing your teeth beside an icy river in the early morning while a burly black bear swims across that same river just upwind of you, shakes his glossy wet coat, and then goes galumping off into the forest. And what better friendships can be made than those carved and polished from long days paddling, especially against a brutal headwind or through terrifying white water. And then finally at day's end, you sit ravenous at first and then deeply satisfied after a scrumptious campfire-cooked supper, sharing stories and probably tending each other's blisters and bug bites too. You and I know that is really living. The canoe trip in remote, rough country is also where there is no place to hide, and I advise young people not to marry until they've survived and even enjoyed a long canoe trip with their intended, because on trip, all is revealed. Who you really are, good or bad, comes out. While we all adore warm days of sun and soft breezes, preferably with a tailwind, I'll bet you'll agree that the best trip stories usually come about when the weather is really, really foul, because that's what separates the wheat from the chaff. The best of what's in you, your strength, resolve, and humor, comes out then. Grit, determination, and laughter. It makes for a heady mixture, and you learn a great deal about your own character and those around you. A canoe trip in the Canadian far north provides lessons in freedom, responsibility, teamwork, group dynamics, resilience, fortitude, and spirit, all while fostering a very deep and meaningful love of this hard and glorious land we call home. It's ours, whether Canadian by birth or by choice. Our young people need to see and experience this firsthand. I'm hooked on paddling and camping, hooked on the wilderness, hooked on the far north of Canada, and on our precious heritage. And my experience has taught me that once you go there, you yearn to return. And now, Madam Zoom would like to close with one of Robert Service's lesser-known poems, The Spell of the Yukon. In the voice of a sourdough gold miner, the poet describes his own passion for our rough and beautiful land in winter and in summer, and what drives him to return again and again. The Spell of the Yukon. I wanted the gold and I sought it. I scrabbled and mucked like a slave. Was it famine or scurvy? I fought it. I hurled my youth into a grave. I wanted the gold and I got it. Came out with a fortune last fall. Yet somehow, life's not what I thought it. And somehow, the gold isn't all. No, there's the land. Have you seen it? It's the cussedest land that I know, from the big dizzy mountains that screen it to the deep death-like valleys below. Some say God was tired when he made it. Some say it's a fine land to shun. Maybe. But there's some as would trade it for no land on earth. And I'm one. You come to get rich, damn good reason. You feel like an exile at first. You hate it like hell for a season. And then you are worse than the worst. It grips you like some kind of sinning. It twists you from foe to a friend. It seems it's been since the beginning. It seems it will be to the end. I've stood in some mighty-mouthed hollow that's plumb full of hush to the brim, and I've watched the big, husky sun wallow in crimson and gold and grow dim, till the moon set the pearly peaks gleaming, and the stars tumbled out neck and crop, and I thought that I surely was dreaming with the peace of the world piled on top. The summer no sweeter was ever, the sunshiny woods all a-thrill, the grayling a-leap in the river, the bighorn asleep on the hill, the strong life that never knows harness, the wilds where the caribous call, the freshness, the freedom, the farness. Oh God, how I'm stuck on it all. The winter, the whiteness that blinds you, the white land locked tight as a drum, the cold fear that follows and finds you, the silence that bludgeons you dumb, the snows that are older than history, the woods where the weird shadows slant, the stillness, the moonlight, the mystery. I've bade him goodbye, but I can't. There's a land where the mountains are nameless and the rivers all run God knows where. There are lives that are erring and aimless and death that just hangs by a hair. There are hardships that nobody reckons. There are valleys unpeopled and still. There's a land, oh, it beckons and beckons, and I want to go back, and I will. They're making my money diminish, and I'm sick of the taste of champagne. Thank God when I'm skinned to a finish, I'll pike to the Yukon again. I'll fight, and you'll bet it's no sham fight. It's hell, but I've been there before, and it's better than this by a damn sight. So for me, it's the Yukon once more. There's gold, and it's haunting, and it's luring me on as of old. Yet it isn't the gold that I'm wanting so much as just finding the gold. It's the great big broad land way up yonder. It's the forests where silence has lease. It's the beauty that thrills me with wonder. It's the stillness that fills me with peace. Thank you.